This time, I'd like to call on Professor Bernstein to speak to us on the topic of Beyond Kyoto, Reconciling Environmental Stewardship with the Economic Demands of the Canadian and the Energy Sector. Professor Bernstein's bio is in your handouts. I would encourage you to become acquainted with it, as the professor has led a very rich and textured life, and we are honored to have him with us here today. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Professor Stephen Bernstein.
Well, thank you very much for that very kind introduction and really a number of remarks that present in a nice context, I think, what the discussion will have. Thanks also to the organizers for inviting me to participate in a conversation on such an important topic for Canada and for our place in the world. I have to admit, though, that it was with a bit of trepidation that I agreed to talk on the topic given to me, and I'm just going to repeat it. Beyond Kyoto, Reconciling Environmental Stewardship with Economic Demands of the Canadian Economy and the Energy Sector. So first, the very premise, Beyond Kyoto, is a polarizing one. The mere mention of Kyoto shuts down conversations for some people, polarizes people, puts them into opposite ends of a debate, from those on the one hand who think that the UN doesn't do anything interesting and this just provides ammunition against why we should act on climate change at all, to those on the other side who think that Kyoto symbolizes Canada's abandonment of its international commitments on perhaps the most serious threat facing the planet. Second, I'm not an economist. So I'm not sure I have much authority to speak on, quote, the economic demands of the Canadian economy and the energy sector, and thankfully we heard from someone who I think has much greater qualifications than I do, let alone how to reconcile that with environmental stewardship, since it seems the best minds, at least in Alberta and in the federal government, have a great deal of trouble with this, and I'm not sure I have the answers either. In fact, I'm sure I don't. Third, I mainly study international politics. So while there are many issues of local and regional sustainability, I'm going to focus my remarks primarily on the international political aspects of this question, although I'll make at least some reference to how to reconcile this with sustainable development, and yet that's another term that has enormous ambiguity, very hard to get our minds around. Classically, sustainable development, of course, means environmental, economic, and social. The problem is it's notoriously difficult to integrate these pillars or properly even evaluate what it means to achieve sustainability in all three simultaneously, let alone to integrate the three together. So we have to ask questions, actually some of which were already raised. Sustainability for whom? For energy producers, for the people living in energy-producing provinces like Alberta or Saskatchewan, for the country, for the planet. Perhaps what we can agree on is that sustainability has a long-term component that seems sometimes to be removed from the debate. So in that sense, I hope to bring at least some of that into the discussion. Also in Canada, the debate tends to be very much focused at the provincial level. Now perhaps, and in fact I was at a conference the other day that Madeline was at as well, perhaps this is because the word national energy policy is something that we can't really mention in the country. So the debate tends to be very much focused provincially. But of course, when we talk about, when we try to think about sustainable development or national sustainable development, the lack of a national strategy is itself a kind of strategy. And the conditions that we make do have a strategic effect on the country as a whole. So in sum, this sort of longish introduction, let me say thank the organizers for a very simple mission. Okay, rather than try to respond directly to all of this, I'm going to really just try to make 4 points. And the 4 points are really to set, a series of baseline or premises that I hope will lead to discussion, and also set some context for, I assume, what will be the debate through the rest of the day and maybe through the rest of the series of meetings that are to be had on this topic. So the first one is energy policy is climate policy and vice versa. Okay, that's point number one. Point number two, there is an international context that is changing and that affects both energy and our climate policy. Third, the most important single policy intervention to address this reality is to put a price on carbon. and it is the one thing that our federal government refuses to do. So where do we go from there? Fourth, the main obstacle to reconciling energy and environmental policy are political and not economic. Actually, I think reflecting what we just heard in the keynote address. Okay, so let me start with the first. Climate policy is energy policy and vice versa. I think this is very non-controversial. I think it's recognized internationally. But it seems to be very difficult for us to get our minds around in Canada, at least at the federal level. So let me give some context as to why I think this is the case. So let's go back to 2006 when the Harper government was first elected. At the time, there was actually, I think, politically very little reason to link climate and energy policy. So you had a situation where you had a government in the U.S. that was outwardly hostile to international action on climate change and had already withdrawn from Kyoto. The electoral base of the Conservative Party was closely linked to parts of the country benefiting from a resource boom, and that was also a major driver of economic growth. And the perception at the time, and this I'm actually borrowing from a colleague at UBC, Kathy Harrison, who this analysis is borrowed from, was that the sectors that stand to lose the most from greenhouse gas reduction employ hundreds of thousands of Canadians, are highly engaged politically, while cleaner industries that might be expected to emerge under an aggressive plan to address climate change remain largely hypothetical and thus relatively silent in contemporary political debates. That's in 2006. Moreover, despite the previous commitments of Canadian governments, either because they relied on voluntary programs, or they had weak incentives, or were just never implemented, actually produced very few results. So it wasn't difficult for the Conservative government coming into power to say, it's not us, previous governments have had difficulty with this policy. So in that context, the Harper government very successfully reframed the policy by attacking Kyoto instead of climate change itself, not only for its binding and differential commitments between North and South, but also, ironically, because it opened the door to international market mechanisms suggesting that, quote, a made-in-Canada policy would be better. I say this is ironic because when I started looking at climate change, when I started researching it, it was the left that was very concerned about market mechanisms and thought that this was a very suspicious way to deal with environmental problems. And of course, it's almost the reverse now. Where the left, although maybe not everyone on the left, but the left is seeing a lot of promise and looking at markets and trying to put a price on carbon, while the right seems to be suspicious or concerned because of the framing of these mechanisms as a tax or as somehow anti-growth. And so what we had in Canada was this idea of a, quote, made in Canada climate policy, which helped diffuse the idea that Canada really had any kind of large international commitment. It's pretty clear in hindsight that what the Harper government was trying to do was to position itself as an emerging energy superpower, which they felt would be much more important for our core economic interests and place in the world. So inattention to climate change, especially because it was being addressed in these very large multilateral gatherings, also happened to fit very well with Canada's emerging foreign policy orientation, which was to be much more selective in where it was engaging internationally. Instead of engaging with the UN and seeing, a seat on the Security Council, even though it stung the government that we didn't get it, in fact, the government really didn't think that sort of thing was that important. Instead, it was focusing on being involved in the right clubs, being involved in networks, supporting public-private partnerships, trying to position Canada with the right groups rather than the old kind of view of Canada is going to punch its weight, it's going to leverage itself in these large international institutions. So the G20, regional and bilateral trade agreements, public-private networks, and so on become important as opposed to these big multilateral gatherings. Okay, so that's the background context. The second point now is that a lot has changed. A lot has changed in 7 years. So a big part of that context is exactly what we just heard in terms of the North American context, but let me just get to that in a minute. The first big thing that's changed is that we are now, we have been the beneficiaries of high commodity prices, especially high oil prices, and that combined with some good fortune in terms of the way our banking sector is structured for long historical reasons, in part by accident, meant that we have weathered the economic crisis extremely well. And a big part of that has been that we have had income from the resource sector. And so we have fared very well compared to many other countries. And this is sort of viewed as a big part of, as a result of our resources. At the same time, Kyoto, sort of going back to the climate change side of things, has come under a lot of attack. The end of the first commitments period has happened. Most countries are not signing on to a second phase. At the same time, though, there hasn't been a reduction in the idea that we need to do something about climate. So as the ground has shifted away from a Kyoto-like agreement, Canada faces increased pressure to play a more positive role because we can no longer say Kyoto is sort of the bogeyman, and we can't follow that. But because of the way it's positioned itself, it's really in the background in international negotiations. And the old kind of made in Canada rhetoric around our climate policy just doesn't really seem to fly anymore because the international political ground has shifted, and there's a sense that there needs to be a response even though we're sort of searching around what that response might be. And the problem is we've lost credibility with the Europeans on the issue, and increasingly we are out of touch with the Americans on this issue. So it's going to be very difficult, I think, for Canada to get what it wants on the international stage. It's very clear that people, at least who are outside of government, but even who are formally in the government, really see this landscape change coming, or that has already come. So, for example, speaking in Calgary last September, former Environment Minister Jim Prentice, Conservative Environment Minister Jim Prentice, said that, quote, "Energy leadership and environmental leadership are now two sides of the same coin. Canada will either be an environmental leader or have other jurisdictions attempt to dictate our environmental policies." And what he was referring to, and actually anticipating a little bit, is clear signals already, even before the election, coming from the U.S., that they were targeting Canada's oil sands in terms of their environmental impact, particularly in regard to climate change. He was already noting a number of moves in terms of fuel standards that he seemed to think would affect could affect our exports, or at least influence our policies, and that we were basically becoming an easy target for U.S. environmentalists in a way that wasn't necessary. And obviously there are many signs that this is exactly what has become focused, the Keystone XL pipeline debate has become the battleground for these issues. So what is most interesting here, I think, is that, well, one cannot underestimate the complexities of local politics, of Aboriginal groups, how that's playing out in terms of pipeline routing, both in Canada and the U.S., the reasons for broad coalitions against the pipeline, and so on and so forth. Despite all of that, despite the local environmental concerns, what's become absolutely clear, at least in my mind, is that the reason for the broad coalition that is making things difficult for Keystone XL, and the reason that it has the ear of the administration as opposed to just the ear of Congress, is because of its perceived relationship to climate change. Thus, like it or not, environmental sustainability is being linked to climate change, and thus sustainable development and a stable climate are inexorably linked. Okay. Another way that this has changed, the landscape of change, has to do, again, returning to Professor Crandall, very much with the way our dependence on energy exports, and the oil sands in particular, in terms of a driver of the economy. And where she ended up is, in fact, the focus of a lot of analysis inside Canada of how much our economy has benefited or not from the shift to resource exports. And just to give you some very basic numbers, in 1999, finished goods made up 60% of our exports. Now that's down to 37%. And oil, it's almost a reversal. Oil is now, I think it's oil, natural resources, not just oil, natural resources, are around 65% of our exports. So our export configuration has really shifted. And this has raised a lot of debate in the country, and again, I'm not an economist, so I don't want to stake my life on this, but has raised debates about whether we're experiencing what's known as the Dutch disease, that our oil price, our dollar is linked to oil prices, and that this has been great for investment and so on in the resource sector, but has crowded out other kinds of investment, has made it more difficult for manufacturing exports and so on. I won't belabor this point, especially because of time, but I will note it just is interesting. We're waiting for the budget. I did hear just a little snippet on the news this morning that that it sounds like some kind of, I don't know what it is, stimulus or something for manufacturing sector as part of the budget. Now I don't know if this is in direct relation to this, but it's clearly noticeable to everybody that our manufacturing sector has been facing difficulties. I think the reasons are complex, but the dollar is probably a factor. And then the last sort of shifting economic point is that the energy makeup of North America in terms of demand and supply is shifting. And again, I won't belabor the point because we heard an excellent presentation on that. I would say, though, maybe just pushing a little bit of what we just heard, is that I think the oil sands in particular, well, certainly our gas industry is vulnerable, but oil sands are also vulnerable to these changes. How they will play out, we don't know. I think a very optimistic scenario for Canada was just painted in the presentation we just heard. Again, I'm not an expert, so I hope we have some discussion, and I'd like to sort of hear more about the scenario that was being constructed earlier. But it does raise serious questions. We're already seeing some pressure on the Alberta economy and so on as prices may stabilize a bit. And finally, the ground is shifting politically. I've already mentioned the changes that have been happening in the U.S., but there also have been very overt moves in the United States that suggest the shift is actually quite serious. So for one, we have the U.S. Ambassador, David Jacobson, sending a very clear signal. In one sense, you could read it as trying to help Canada. Here's what you need to do to get the Keystone XL passed more smoothly. Commenting directly on our environment and our climate policy, essentially saying that we are either part of the solution to climate change or we're not. If we're not part of it, the U.S. is taking notice, and that's going to create difficulties for you. A pretty, strong statement coming from a foreign government. We're also seeing signals in the Obama administration in terms of appointments. So we have, for example, the appointments still having to be approved in terms of head of the EPA, Gina McCarthy, and Ernest Moniz to run the Department of Energy, both of whom are seen as not radical, but certainly sympathetic to stronger action and using the regulatory powers, for example, of the EPA to try to get stronger action on climate change, even if Congress doesn't move. We also, in the background, know that the global terrain is shifting on this issue. So even though it's not likely that we're going to see in at least this Congress a cap-and-trade system nationally in the U.S., we know that there's lots of activity on the ground in terms of trying to create a price for carbon, and California being the most obvious and latest example. But also that any measure that the United States has put forward, though those mostly haven't passed at the national level, have always included some kind of border tax or some kind of external measure that would affect imports that were not subject to a similar kind of price mechanism. And we've also seen this with China passing, looks like passing some kind of carbon tax. So we can expect this kind of thing, that Canada is now situated within this environment. Okay. Third point. If there's one policy intervention that almost everyone agrees will link energy and climate together, it's to put a price on carbon. Again, I'm not an economist, but I haven't spoken to an economist in the last 10 years who said otherwise. Okay? There's arguments about should it be cap and trade, should it be a tax, how should the tax be constructed, are there other ways of doing it, should we hide it, should we make it more public, should, who should pay, so on. But everybody agrees, virtually everybody agrees, that this is the most efficient and the most likely way to actually get to where every single Canadian climate plan has been since Kyoto was first passed. There is also agreement through the best analysis in the country from the National Roundtable on Environment and Economy, which is by no means a left-wing or environmental kind of organization, an organization created by Mulroney, actually reinvigorated under the Harper government, but then canceled when perhaps it produced some findings that the government didn't particularly like, or perhaps they think they just did their job and it was complete. Basically said that, to quote David McLaughlin, the former head of the National Roundtable, he said, there is only one sector that matters most for Canada when it comes to getting emissions down, the oil sands. If oil sands emissions go down, we meet our national carbon reduction targets. If not, we don't. Okay? So even though, of course, there's lots of other things we can do, the fact of the imprint of those emissions on the overall carbon footprint in the country and the way in which those emissions are rising, that needs to be the target. So it does beg the question, and it is an honest question that I have, who exactly is telling the government not to put a price on carbon? It's not entirely clear to me. Many in industry support putting a price on carbon. We know Alberta is already doing it at a small scale. It's criticized, but they are already doing it. The die is cast. BC is doing it. Quebec is doing it. And we also know that many of our large companies, including some in the oil sector like Shell and so on, are already doing shadow pricing because they are anticipating an international environment in which there is going to be a price on carbon. So why the resistance? It's also leading to some funny politics where you have the minister, the premier of Alberta going down to Washington and touting, what all the, the things of some of which we heard of what Alberta is doing, including putting a price on carbon. And then you have our federal government going down and senior ministers going down to Washington and saying, we're doing all these wonderful things, everything we heard, and there were some inaccuracies in what were said, which we could talk about later. But we're doing all these wonderful things, but the one thing we will not do is put a price on carbon. Which I think is really sending a very strange message to Washington and to the administration, and again, just creates a very easy target for those who are opposed to oil sands production. Finally, let me talk a little bit about the obstacles. Why is this such a challenge? What are the obstacles that we face? And obviously there are many, but I'll just address some of the political ones since that's sort of my neck of the woods. The first one is sort of to answer maybe a bit of my rhetorical question before, why is the federal government doing it? And again, to be fully upfront, I'm borrowing some ideas that I heard in our conference the other day because I think they were spot on, so I can't take credit for all of these ideas. The main reason, or the best explanation that I've heard, and it makes total sense to me, is that the conservative federal government has basically tied its hands in terms of climate policy. So I think they recognize the terrain has shifted, but they've gone around the country for the last 7 years raising money based on the fact that they will never have a carbon tax. And they've attacked the two opposition parties for doing exactly that. So it makes it very difficult for them to formulate how it is that they're going to go about this, even though they know that we will never get to, forget our Kyoto target, we will never get to our Copenhagen target without a tax. When the minister said, or the parliamentary secretary said, we're halfway there, what he meant was, we're halfway in 2020 to getting where we want to go, not that we're halfway to achieving our goal. So I think that politically they've tied their hands. The second is we have a major problem with federal-provincial cooperation. This seems to be at an all-time low on the issue. I think there's lots of reasons for that, some to do with the way in which energy policy has been constructed before. But another big problem is basically because there is no national leadership, it is very difficult for the provinces to coordinate on this issue. So there's no institutional framework, good institutional framework for cooperation. And this leads to big problems in a country like Canada because there are distributional issues, there are winners and losers depending on how the economy and the resource sector is structured and so on. And without good cooperation, it's very difficult, and that goes from just where how the pipeline goes and who gets revenues and so on and so forth, which we're seeing between Alberta and British Columbia, but also larger issues to do with the configuration of how energy sources and so on move across the country, producers and consumers, this Dutch disease and so on, these kinds of debates. Okay, in terms of final solutions or suggestions, actually, I think I will leave that open. What I will say is that apart from the price on carbon, there are many good ideas out there. We heard a number at our conference yesterday. We hear all kinds of solutions from industry. We hear solutions from the sort of think tank sector. But there doesn't seem to be the kind of national dialogue that most countries are having on this sort of issue. So I guess my one suggestion I'll leave with is to sponsor industry-sponsored dialogues that bring the federal government to the table. That's the sort of best solution I can think of. If we hear from industry more on this, looking out at the horizon, I think that that might be the only way to give the federal government cover to move. I can't really see another way for it to happen. I think there is activity in industry already, but there is not the national forum. And again, sadly, there just doesn't seem to be a partner to listen to creative ways to reconcile. And I'll just end on one final point. The government in power is very smart politically, I think, very, very smart. And they have framed this debate historically very, very cleverly to provide a means for the policies that they felt were best for the country. Okay? Whether I did or not, they certainly felt that way. I think they have the creativity to reframe this issue, but they need cover to do so. So hopefully we can come up with some solutions that will allow them to move in that direction. Thank you.